Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ. My name is Andy. We are broadcasting on Yagra and Turrbal Country. And today on the show, we're going to be doing a little history lesson that's, I think, somewhat topical at the moment to what's been in the news. It is a history of welfare policy in Australia. And I spoke to historian John Murphy, who's written two books, one up to the Second World War, middle of the 20th century, and one then after that about the history of Australian welfare policy. And so he has a good overview of what is a long and complex story, but one that I think is so interesting. And it's one of the ways I've been able to do this show for a very long time, doing who knows how many interviews over the years every week, is that you just got to be interested in a lot of things, and you see something, you just see a mention of this guy writing these histories of Australian welfare policy, and I was like, yeah, I'd be interested in talking to that guy about that. Because, you know, it's not a given that we have the welfare system that we do. Certainly other parts of the world that are equally wealthy nations as Australia don't have an equivalent welfare system. Some, of course, have a more comprehensive welfare system than Australia does. But also, I think, given the human track record of how well we kind of look after strangers who we don't know, how much we care for strangers that we don't know, it's somewhat surprising, actually, in some ways, that we have the welfare system that we do, that people are happy for, you know, all Australians to have access to some of these things. And there are debates, as we will hear, about who deserves access and what exactly they deserve to get and how it should be funded and things like that. But the fact that we have it, sometimes I think is quite a miracle. And yes, recently having, you know, gone through the process of having a child, you have a lot more hospital and doctor appointments than I would have previously in my life. And every time I do think it is amazing that we have this, actually, that the government does provide this for all Australians. And so today we're going to look into how did that happen. It's a quick overview, admittedly. You know, we only have 1 hour to discuss, you know, a century and a half or so of political arguments and developments. But we'll give it a go. And, of course, it has been in the news recently, welfare. I think the budget announcements, the cuts to the NDIS, and we'll talk about that. The other thing that we don't really talk about, of course, is the coalition kind of turning welfare into a racial issue, which is, yes, interesting as well, talking about, you know, that if they got in, they would restrict access to welfare to people that are not Australian citizens, whether they've paid taxes that funded it or not, which of course is interesting. I think there's a lot to be learnt about political debate and how it functions with these kind of things that are wheeled out again and again, these same kind of tropes, I guess. But yes, as I said, you know, a lot of Australia are people that are, you know, conservatively inclined, and a lot of Australia's government has been conservative governments, and yet the welfare system has survived. And unlikely survival, which is the title of John Murphy's second volume of welfare policy history. Anyway, having said all that, there's a lot to talk about, and John Murphy, he knows a lot, and so let's get into it.
Okay, I'm John Murphy. I've worked as a historian for about many decades, let's say, in universities at RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and then at University of Melbourne, and spent a lot of time teaching students about Australian political history and also about the place of welfare policy in that history.
Yes, and outside of the university, you've written a 2-volume history of Australian welfare policy, and that's what we'll be discussing today. I guess to start off with, what inspired you to write this history? Why do you think it was important?
So I guess for occupational necessity in the parts that I was teaching, I was working my way into understanding all this area better. So I think over years I've spent quite a long time reading about, thinking about and talking about with students how welfare has worked in Australia. And I think it's a very important part of our history, and it's an important part of the sort of political notions of justice and fairness that I think have a good and important place in our history. So, I've written books on other things. I wrote a book about Doc Evatt, the Labor leader, book about Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. So it's not the only thing I've worked on, but it's been an enduring kind of interest for decades now.
Yes, well, before we go further, I think we should ask the question of how do you define welfare?
So welfare policy, I'd define as deliberate attempts to shield citizens from simply a market economy, so that reduces the dependence of people on their market position, especially when their market position is very poor, and they're weak, and they're ill, and they have disability, and they have fate intervening and knocking them off their feet. So I think you could see welfare policy as a deliberate attempt in specific different areas like old age and disability and single parenthood, a deliberate attempt to shield people from being simply dependent upon themselves. So I think it's best seen as an attempt in different bits to deal with the questions of inequality and unfairness, but also to deal with fate, just with the things that strike people down, like, ill health. So I think it's a contribution to a sort of image of solidarity of a society.
Yes, and I will go through, I guess, some of Australia's history, but maybe we should start at the start. And Australia is not very old as a nation state, but I assume neither is sort of nation state welfare policy. So I am wondering, what did Australia at the beginning of its colonisation, what did it inherit from the old world in terms of welfare policy?
Yeah, it's a good point, Andy. So, in the late 18th century, when the first invasion began, the traditions in England in particular were pretty tough. There was a provision going back to Elizabeth I's days of a poor law, which the poor law itself is much maligned these days, but it had a kind of sense that at a parish level, those that could afford to were expected to provide some sort of support that would be redistributed to the poor. So there was a sort of element of local level responsibility and solidarity in the poor law. But by the middle of the 19th century, that had been reformed drastically, so that with the growing emphasis on market economy and individualism in the 19th century England, there was a shift in the poor law, which meant effectively, no, you didn't get wages subsidised or what was called outdoor relief. There was only effectively indoor relief, which meant building institutions which were worse than being outside, basically. So they were like prisons, and their conditions were such that only the utterly desperate would want to go into them. So by the mid-19th century, when there is some discussion about these questions of welfare and inequality in Australia, that's what people are thinking of. They're thinking of the poor law as a particularly draconian system of dealing with poverty. So that's a very early stages. I mean, it's not until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you start to get things such as discussion about age pensions, very little emphasis at all on relieving poverty in itself. But the other dimension that I think is important in Australia is a fairly strong commitment growing through the 19th century to fair wages. That wages should be adequate, and given the nature of, at different times, of the balance of supply and demand for labour, there were times when the emerging labour movement was actually quite strong and could argue for fair wages. And so the institutions that sort of built up around that in the last decades of the 19th century, wages boards and forms of arbitration in each of the colonies, meant there was quite a strong emphasis on the notion that wages should be adequate to keep you out of poverty. That was a very progressive development, but it tended to mean those who weren't in the labour market, didn't have access to a breadwinner, if you like, could be particularly precarious. So there's an awful lot going on in that, and I'll spend quite a bit of time, but it's really not until the late 19th century and the beginnings of the 20th century that in either Europe or Australia you start to get much emphasis on what we now think of as welfare policies per se.
This is a broad question that I suppose I'm just thinking of now, but what was the driving force? Obviously, the role of the state is changing, but also there's sort of been an industrial revolution, and I don't know, the nature of work and communities is changing. What was the driving force for a more institutionalised welfare system, do you think?
Well, I guess the story in England and its offshoots especially, but also in Europe through the 19th century, is the entrenchment of a free labour market, of the notion that people were simply working for wages, and as Marx put it, were a free proletariat who had nothing to sell but their labour. And so wages became, much more central from really the 18th century in England and the Industrial Revolution. Wages became much more central in people's lives, so that you get much less of the influence of local community, of barter, of customary obligations one to another, and much more of a, what economists would describe as a free labour market where people are simply working for wages and then involved in something of a struggle or a balancing act with employers about how adequate those wages will be. So I think that emergence in the 18th and 19th century of a kind of individualised society in which work and wages are all that bind us together, if you like. I think with a bit of a time lag, there's then increasingly, for some people, and I guess mostly on the left, a focus on, well, if we've lost those other forms of connection and support, and we're all individuals in a labour market, what are the collective forms of response when that all goes wrong? So by the late 19th century, you're starting to get people theorising about the role of the state in balancing that individualised labour market.
Well, let's go back to Australian history, and Australia, I suppose, at the beginning of the 20th century, it had a reputation as a kind of place of equality compared to a lot of places in the world, like a workers' paradise or a social laboratory. How did welfare policy fit with all of this?
Okay, so that kind of notion of a social laboratory is very strong, and particularly is applied to Australia and New Zealand in the late 19th century. I guess we should always, remember that this is talking about the white settler society that's imposed upon an Aboriginal society, which was, obviously drastically disrupted by settler colonialism. But in the white settler colonial societies, there's the preconditions, if you like, of a social laboratory. And when English visitors came out to Australia to sort of see, what's the future look like? What is being done in these new sort of experimental conditions, if you like? Two things that are frequently noted are there's no old landed aristocracy. Right? So there are wealthy people, of course, and some of them had pretensions to the squatters turning themselves into aristocracy, but there isn't that break on political reform, if you like, that conservative aristocracy has so often meant in England. The second thing that people frequently noticed was about family. You got much less of the extended family. You got a lot more people who arrive alone, join up with others, but there was a sort of a formulation of this long ago by Pat Grimshaw, where she said in Australia the modern family was born early, a sort of nuclear family, parents and children, not extended kin, was early developed in Australia because people tended to migrate on their own. So they're two things that contributed to the possibility of a social laboratory. I think the third that contributed is the labour movement was quite strong and quite early on, so that the notion that workers could form unions and could have capacity for strike action and could make demands and negotiate developed pretty early in Australia and into a fairly robust sort of movement. So that certainly contributed. As I said earlier, it contributed most to the notion of fair wages and not so much to the notion of those who are left behind by that system of fair wages. And fourthly, I think there's also contributing to this atmosphere of experimentation is that liberalism in Australia, and especially in Victoria in the late 19th century, was quite progressive. In these kinds of dimensions of thinking about what's to be done about inequality, of thinking about what's the role of the state. There'd been through the 18th and 19th century a form of liberalism in England in particular, which was really, the free market liberalism we think of today. The reduced role of the state, less tax, allow individuals to get on with their lives. But alongside that, and fairly strong in Australia, was a social liberal tradition which tended to emphasise more the expectation that the state could and should be involved, and that might be the state's involved in regulating fair wages, which is very much what happened in Australia. But it can also be that they think of, the state could be involved and should be involved in providing adequate pensions, for example, for people who reach old age without any resources. So I think all those things contributed to a pretty dynamic and experimental phase at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century.
So can you lead us through, I guess, some of the significant developments in Australian welfare policy?
Yes, thinking chronologically, by 1900 there's quite a lot of discussion and in some cases experimentation with age pensions. There was a bit of a race on, really, that New South Wales wanted to get in first before Victoria, and they were both watching that South Australia didn't dash in before them. So there was quite a lot of discussion, royal commissions, inquiries, policy proposals and debates in parliaments about old age pensions and how they should be funded, and particularly who should be eligible for them. So that's probably apart from the development of the wages systems, which goes a little bit earlier, the age pension experiments would be the first major formal attempts at specific welfare policy for specific groups. And they're all amalgamated after Federation, but not actually consolidated together until 1908, 1909 in the Commonwealth Old Age Pension. So there's that trajectory. At the same time, and to some extent in parallel with that, were invalid pensions, which would be the precursor, the ancestor of our current disability support pension. This invalid pensions at the time, thinking about the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, invalid pensions actually were thought of not so much for people with disabilities as workers who were broken before the age of the pension. Miners especially, they thought of. Miners had an occupation where they frequently got to the 65-year, or before the 65-year limit for the age pension, and they were already broken. So invalid pensions were often imagined really for workers whose working lives had crippled them. And that's again, that 1909, 1910 at the Commonwealth level that those are instituted. So they're the first big steps, I think you'd say, in this construction of what we, would call the institutional bits of a welfare state. I think it's worth thinking about that they're based on a particular model of funding and eligibility. So they're funded from tax, and those who are eligible are decided with a means test, depending on, you've got to be poor enough to be eligible. And so early on, that's the model that's adopted in Australia, and in quite a contrast to European traditions, which were much more based on a social insurance model. So that, the social insurance model was one in which particularly workers, not necessarily all citizens, but the working class, if you like, were required to save for old age, or required to save for invalidity, required to save for healthcare. So Germany was the example of that. In Bismarck's Germany in the late 19th century, the establishment of a social insurance model of welfare. That was debated in Australia and largely rejected, but it's bubbled along ever since, and it's been something that the Liberal side of politics and its predecessors have always been attracted to for various reasons. So just getting back to our quick narrative history of welfare policies, the next major thing was the maternity allowance that was instituted by a Labor government in 1911, I think from memory, available to all mothers at a birth, a one-off payment, no means test, and distinctively, very progressively for the time, whether they were married or not. And critics came to Andrew Fisher, the Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister, and said, this is just going to be an invitation for lust, for young women to go out and get pregnant to get the maternity allowance. And he replied that he was just not going to change it. As he put it, it was for ensuring that women had medical care in childbirth. And as he said, this 1911, he said, childbirth is more dangerous than warfare. Now, that was before the First World War, which showed how dangerous warfare could be, but it captures some of the sort of sense of that initiative as a one-off, just to ensure that birth was less dangerous. Not much happens then. There's not much happens in terms of welfare initiatives. The First World War obviously disrupted things. During the First World War, there was a parallel welfare system set up for veterans and for war widows, and that's quite important and proves to be a big drain on resources in the post-war years, so that it's sort of, this parallel veterans welfare state to some extent stunted the growth of other initiatives. At the national level, there's really quite a long wait until 1941, which would be the next major initiative, which is done by the United Australia Party, the precursor of the Liberal Party. Child endowment, a supplementary payment directed to mothers for dependent children up to the age of 16. And that had been debated a lot, but it's actually the United Australia Party under Robert Menzies that instituted it in 1941. And then really the next major chunk of welfare would be unemployment benefits, sickness benefits in the late 1940s, 45, 46, by the chiefly Labor government right at the end of the war. So, I mean, that gives you, up to the middle of the century, if you like, middle of the 20th century, a bit of a sketch of how things were developing. And I think it's worth remembering that they were usually based on this taxpayer-funded, means-tested form of benefits. That's the model that the Labor Party in particular tended to favour.
Obviously, that interacted with a number of political events happening at that time. I mean, you mentioned war, and there was, of course, the Great Depression. But I'm also interested in how, I guess, the rest of the world was developing. How did Australia's welfare policy compare and maybe interact with other parts of the world?
Yes, so there's certainly interaction, particularly back to England. I mean, I think a lot of Australian reformers thinking about these things would look to what's going on in England, and England, after the Second World War, was instituting a welfare state on, sort of fairly systematic basis. There is an argument which I think has got quite a lot of substance that Australia was backward. So despite that quick chronicle account I just gave, and despite the notion of the social laboratory, that there was a way in which the emphasis on fair wages, which is a very progressive dimension in Australian political history, the ways in which that actually stunted the rest, right? Because it sort of took attention away from the notion of dealing with particular instances of poverty. So I think if you took a point around 1950, Australia was not particularly progressive. Australia was not particularly unequal because we had a well-established wages system which distributed the benefits, if you like, through the wages system to most families. But as of 1950, Australia's probably a laggard in terms of all those who don't have access to wages, to widows, to single parents, people with disabilities, certainly Aboriginal people. And so there's a complex way. It's quite hard to get your head around in a way that, we could be quite progressive in some areas and somewhat backward in other things. So that it's really not until the 1970s under Whitlam that you get the next kind of surge of explicit welfare policy, and especially in healthcare, Medibank, the precursor of Medicare, and in a number of new welfare benefits which are explicitly intended to deal with particular types of poverty or disadvantage. Single mother's benefit in 1973, means-tested support for students, both school and university students, which is, designed to remove the impediment to getting access to education for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and a really big emphasis on funding community kind of initiatives and community developments. So it's not until the 70s really that Australia started catching up, I guess. So in terms of the original question, I think, we were progressive with a strong labour movement, and somewhat backward, in the other areas that you can think of welfare provision.
With any kind of history like this, I guess there's a lot of names of, important people, the prime ministers or the ministers for welfare or whatever it might be. But I'm interested in what was the role of social struggle in making these developments happen. Good question. I think there are particular moments you can certainly identify where social activists, including the union movement, are very prominent. So the best example, I think, perhaps of that would be the re-establishment of Medicare
under the Hawke government. So Medibank, which was Medicare as we know it largely, was established right at the end of the Whitlam government, was then demolished by the Fraser government. And the union movement, as part of its agreement with the incoming Hawke government, basically the deal in the accord was to limit wage demands to the cost of living, to inflation, and not go above that. And in return, the government would commit to social spending. And the key first item on that list, the agenda there, was re-establishing Medicare. So there's an example there of, the union movement as a social movement, which, has often not been as expansive beyond just the particular demands of particular unions for wages and conditions for their workers. That was an example where the union movement and the ACTU leadership in particular put a welfare policy right at the top of their agenda, re-establishing universal healthcare insurance. I guess there are other examples I can think of, Andy, that where social movements and struggles in the wider society have an impact. I think disability is an interesting case for that. So by the 1970s, you get in the emergence in the disability sector of quite strong advocacy groups on behalf of those with disability, particularly having a rights-based agenda, the rights of people with disabilities to live full lives, to not be sequestered away in institutions, to have as much independence as possible, and autonomy and decision-making and empowerment and so on. So that's quite a strong movement in the 70s onwards into the 80s and 90s. So they're two examples where I think you could say, okay, there are movements going on, there are debates being had in the wider civil society where people are pushing for particular things and at times succeeding in them. There are other cases, I think, where what we would call the non-government welfare sector had been quite influential. So I'm thinking there of the church-based welfare organisations, groups like the Brotherhood of St Lawrence and Anglicare and so on, where they were quite active in pushing for changes, pushing for reforms. I think that's quite prominent in the Whitlam government in the 1970s. That sector was quite strong and well organised and well led from the 70s onwards. Its presence, I think, was clearly a brake on the Fraser government. The Fraser government would have liked to have gone further in cutting into welfare, but was too scared of the outcry they would cause. So there's a way in which, the sort of balance of forces is actually quite significant in what governments can't do, in a more negative sense, to what had been established in the welfare sector. So I think that yes, the kind of idea behind your question, Andy, is welfare is not just a matter of what some governments do or some governments choose not to do. It's also a matter of wider constituencies, particularly groups like the non-government welfare sector and groups like disability activists.
You're listening to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ. We are talking with John Murphy about a history of Australian welfare. I'm going to play the last bit of the interview now, and we talk a bit about current events as permitting. And one thing, John Murphy here is quite supportive of Labor's action on the NDIS. As you'll hear, it's a nuanced opinion. I do think I would highlight that other shows on 4ZZZ have different opinions. I know Radio Reversal did a show critiquing particularly the propaganda around the NDIS that led to these cuts, which I think you could say was an orchestrated attempt of kind of softening the blow, which is interesting as well because it shows that there's some degree of public sympathy that they felt they had to, limit. And Only Human as well, unfortunately, was at our disability show on Sundays. And so, yeah, people with disabilities, they have strong critiques of the cuts, but I think there's also things about NDIS as a system that leads it to growing substantially with money. I mean, it's a market-based system, and markets want to grow, don't they? And so anyway, we'll go to the last part of my interview with John Murphy now. As we have this interview, of course, welfare has been in the news, and a couple of debates, I guess, about, say, the NDIS and, I guess, who is deserving of welfare and how much. And then the other debate is about the opposition policy about, I guess, race and belonging to a nation and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could tell us, are these kind of recurring motifs in the debates around welfare, or what have been some of the significant kind of debates that that have, shaped Australian welfare policy?
I think the notion of deserving is always there. I mean, in the second of those books I wrote on welfare, the more recent one, Unlikely Survival, I pointed out the ways in which, especially by the Howard government, but it's established earlier, there's kind of a hierarchy of welfare recipients. Aged pensioners are not usually attacked, right? People don't go around maligning aged pensioners for receiving their pension. So they'll be at the top of the scale. At the bottom of the scale were and are single mothers and the unemployed, who are most often attacked as the least deserving. To be honest, by non-Labor governments, though Labor governments can indulge in that as well. There's a legitimate argument there, especially if we've got a targeted welfare system, and it's one that's paid by all of us. So if you think back to the earlier point, sorry, I'll just digress here for a sec. Think back to the earlier point about a social insurance model. If we had a social insurance model where everybody was contributing based on their income to a fund which would then supply them with healthcare or unemployment insurance or whatever, that is much less likely to be subject to attack than one where people are basically easily maligned as living off, the efforts of others. No one says that about superannuation, that you're not entitled to access your superannuation. No one says you're living on superannuation and you're bludgeoning off it. It's kind of a nonsense because we have this imaginary of, well, you've paid for it. You can say that of all welfare, that we've paid for it, but then that goes to the progressivity or not of the tax system, that who pays the most tax and who gets the most benefit still becomes part of the dynamic. So I think the notion of deserving is always there, and there is something, I think, still legitimate about it. It's a question that's worth asking. Who do we want to get the benefit of this government support, which is paid for by us as taxpayers? I don't think it's illegitimate to ask that question. It's just that it can be answered in generous or mean-spirited sorts of ways. I think, you mentioned the NDIS debate at the moment. The NDIS is a very interesting kind of institution, very unusual in Australia. So it's called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which makes it sound a bit like that insurance model of welfare, but it's not. It's completely funded by taxpayers. It's insurance in the sense that we're all potentially included in it. If I get knocked down by a car tomorrow and I have a significant disability as a result, then I'm covered. So it's universal coverage and insurance in that sense. But it's simply funded from taxation, and it's not means tested, which is another interesting dimension of it. That you can be as wealthy as you like and still be just as entitled. It came out to some extent of that earlier rights-based disability advocacy model, where people with disability were saying we don't want to be infantilised, we want to be empowered. And that's the idea that's at the core of the NDIS, that people who are eligible and are assessed effectively are given a budget, and then they go and spend it. Right? They're entitled to go and spend it where they like on the, there are kind of rules about on what sorts of services and so on, but they become contractors, if you like, and that's the empowerment dimension of the NDIS. The two things that have been debated a lot, and which I think are worth talking about with the NDIS and its massive blowout, were firstly that kind of model of going out as an independent contractor and buying services, especially if the services are not regulated, can be a real trap. And there've been quite a few cases, quite a few instances of systematic fraud and criminal fraud, and organised criminal groups getting involved in being providers for the NDIS and rorting the system outrageously. So I think this Labor government has put in quite a bit of effort on cleaning that up, particularly by establishing a register of who's a provider. The other thing I think with the NDIS that has also been talked about a lot is that it blew out because, as Bill Shorten always said, it wasn't supposed to be, but it became the only lifeboat in the ocean. That once you get something that's so universal, established, all the other providers, and especially the states, withdrew. And so, you get this dynamic of the states effectively shifting what had been their separate responsibilities, especially for kids with learning difficulties and autism and so on, shifting them onto the Commonwealth. And we've all heard the stories of that. Again, they're trying to remedy that by having a separate stream called Thriving Kids, which is intended to ensure that that whole sector of kids with learning difficulties, not necessarily serious lifelong disabilities, but learning difficulties, that they're catered for and adequately assisted. But it wasn't what the NDIS was supposed to be for. So in both those cases, there's questions about who's entitled to what, and they're legitimate to ask, and there's questions about who should pay, and they're legitimate to ask. The really disappointing thing about the NDIS, which I support, think it's a major new part of the welfare architecture and should be supported. The really disappointing thing was the way that it also allowed access of criminals and fraudsters to the honeypot, and that's the kind of thing I think the Labor government has correctly identified as that undermines the social licence. If people think, well, this has just a rort, they're not going to support it. So that's a rather long answer to your question, Andy, but I think going back to the starting point, one of the themes that is always there, and I think it's legitimate that it's there, is who is this for, and who should pay for it.
Yes, well, just finally, I guess you've spent a lot of time studying this history. What do you think is its relevance for us today as we try to make a good society?
Well, I think welfare policy has always been wrapped up in that wider debate about what sort of society we want, what's fairness, what's opportunity, how much involvement and regulation do we want in society, and the broader, more ethical questions, I guess, of what does social justice mean and what does fairness mean. So I don't think it's just an ancient history. All of those policies that I've talked about, going back to the wages system, going back to the age pension, they then go through their ups and downs, their reforms, their revolutions. Some of them go backwards. I think the wages system clearly has gone backwards. So each of the bits of the architecture, if you like, that have been built are always being stress tested and are always being revised and at times being eroded. And at times being strengthened, and I think it's an important dimension and opportunity. This kind of stuff, when we have these kinds of policies in place, and they're then the subject of struggles backwards and forwards, or sort of like they've become part of our society and they're with us, but they're not to be taken for granted.
That is John Murphy, there, historian who has studied the history of Australian welfare policy. You can read his 2-volume section. The first one is called A Decent Provision, Australian Welfare Policy 1870 to 1949. The second one is called An Unlikely Survival, The Politics of Welfare in Australia since 1950. And there's another book called Half a Citizen, a book based on interviews with welfare recipients. And so he has, been studying that. And, it is such a important part of our society and a history of people trying to figure out how to live well as a community, a big community of 20 plus million people now, and what responsibility we have to each other. And these are really interesting philosophical questions as well as hard, pragmatic political questions. It should also be said that a lot of the great music in Australian history has probably been funded by Centrelink, and so has a lot of the great political activism that's happened. It's acted as a kind of informal community grant for people whose skills don't necessarily fit into the market economy, and that is an important thing to note as well. And we had limited time to cover everything in this interview with John Murphy, and I did hope to talk to him more about, relationship between the colonial state and Aboriginal people and the role welfare has played in that. And I did not get a chance to ask that question, and it's a complicated story. But yes, I hope you enjoyed that show today, and I'll be here on your radio, same time every week. Catch you later.